Have you ever walked away from a conversation with your adult child, feeling more like a stranger than a parent? Maybe you started with good intentions, just checking in, offering a bit of advice, or even setting a small boundary, and somehow ended up carrying the weight of guilt, confusion, or even shame. And the strange part is, you can't even explain exactly what you did wrong. You just know that suddenly. It felt like you were the villain in a story you didn't write. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Many older adults I speak with say they feel like they're walking on eggshells around their grown children, tiptoeing around topics, avoiding disagreements, constantly replaying conversations in their heads. And for some, those eggshells have become landmines. They feel drained, second-guessed, and often silenced. This isn't just about kids today being sensitive or different. No, what we're talking about today goes deeper than that. It's something much harder to face, but far more important to understand, especially if you're in your 60s, 70s, or beyond, and still searching for peace in your family relationships. We're talking about children who develop deeply self-focused patterns of behavior. Now I know, that's a hard thing to hear. And I'm not saying your child is a monster, or that they're beyond love or healing. But some adult children develop patterns that leave their parents stuck in a painful emotional loop. They twist conversations, weaponize emotions, and somehow manage to make you feel like the problem, no matter how hard you try. In this video, we're going to gently uncover the 9 hidden emotional mechanisms these children often use to stop you from being yourself. Not to blame or shame, but to help you finally breathe, stand tall, and say, I get it now. I'm allowed to be me. Let's begin with something that often goes unnoticed, but runs your emotional life from the inside out. It's what I call the emotional operating system, and it's been running in the background for years. If your child has these tendencies, there's a good chance they've installed in you 3 very strong programs: guilt, shame, and anxiety. You might not even notice them at first. It could be as simple as your daughter sighing on the phone when you say you can't babysit, or your son replying with, I guess we're just not important enough, when you mention you already had plans. And suddenly, there it is, that sinking feeling in your chest. Maybe you start to question yourself. Am I being selfish? Maybe I should just cancel? I don't want to upset anyone? That's guilt. Or maybe you bring something up, like a boundary around your finances or privacy, and their response isn't just disappointment, it's outrage. They accuse you of being controlling, cold, or not like other parents. And even though you were calm and honest, you find yourself thinking, maybe I am the problem. Maybe I've always been. That's shame. And sometimes it doesn't even take a conversation. The mere thought of upsetting them can fill you with so much dread that you avoid saying anything at all. You rehearse what you might say, but never follow through. You don't speak up when they cross the line. You keep the peace, at the cost of your peace. That's anxiety. You see, when a child who seeks control wants to stay in charge, they don't always shout or slam doors. Sometimes they train you, bit by bit, to feel what serves them, to feel bad for having your own needs, to feel scared of their reaction, to feel like being your full self is somehow dangerous or wrong. That emotional programming wasn't yours to begin with, but you've been carrying it, like an old coat you forgot to take off. And now it's time to hang it up. Because choosing yourself is not betrayal. Setting a boundary is not cruelty. Having your own needs, opinions, and feelings does not make you a bad parent. It makes you human. Now, let's talk about something just as important, but a little harder to name. Have you ever wondered who you'd be if your child's approval wasn't part of the equation? What hobbies you'd try, what opinions you'd voice, what parts of yourself might finally come out of hiding? For many parents, especially those who raise difficult or emotionally demanding children, Their sense of self never really had a chance to grow independently. Because when your child's needs, moods, and expectations take center stage, you often end up losing track of your own. Children with strong self-focused patterns don't just ask for love. They ask for loyalty, attention, and often your identity. Without meaning to, you may have built your entire sense of self around keeping the peace, making them happy, or avoiding their disapproval. And over time, that becomes your role. The fixer, the peacekeeper, the emotional punching bag, the reliable one, the quiet one, the available at all hours one. But here's the hard truth. That's not who you really are. That's who you had to become. You might have been creative once, curious, outspoken. Maybe you had dreams that got tucked away when parenting became all-consuming. Maybe you made yourself smaller so they could shine brighter. Maybe you gave more than you had, over and over, because that was the only way to earn a little bit of peace. And now, maybe you don't even recognize what's left. That's what happens when someone is never allowed to know themselves without the dysfunction. You become who the family needs you to be, not who you actually are. And even when you try to step away, something tugs at you. You feel lost without the old roles. You worry you're being selfish. Or you look at yourself in the mirror and think, who am I if I'm not bending over backwards anymore? Let me tell you something. Just because you don't know the answer yet, doesn't mean the real you isn't still there. She's just been quiet for a while. He's just been waiting for permission to speak. And the beautiful thing about growing older is this. It's never too late to meet yourself again. Not as someone's parent, not as someone's fixer, but as you. You might be surprised by how much light is still in you, by how much you still want to give, to explore, to laugh without guilt, or look in someone's eyes and say, no, that's not okay with me, and mean it. Your child may never say thank you for everything you've done. They may never understand the ways they've taken from you emotionally. But you don't need their understanding to begin healing. You just need your own permission. And today, maybe for the first time, you can begin to give that to yourself. Sometimes we grow so used to dysfunction, we stop realizing it's dysfunction at all. We call it just how life is. We say things like, well, that's just how she is. Or, I know he can be difficult, but he's my son. We don't always say it out loud, but deep down we've convinced ourselves that being on edge, being dismissed, being criticized or walked over, that it's somehow normal. And that's exactly what children with these patterns are counting on. You see, if they can convince you that dysfunction is normal, then you won't question it. You won't notice how one-sided the relationship has become. You won't see how little space there is for your opinions, your values, your emotions. You'll just accept it. Maybe they explode when you offer an opinion they don't like. Maybe they withdraw affection when you make a choice they disagree with. Maybe they constantly rewrite the story, making you out to be the bad guy, no matter how gently you tried to speak. And each time, instead of saying, "This isn't okay," you tell yourself, "Well, I guess this is just how parenting adult children works." But it's not. That's not how love works. That's how emotional manipulation works. When we grow up around dysfunction or spend years inside it, it can start to feel familiar, even comfortable. We might mistake the tension for closeness. We might think the chaos means passion, or that the anxiety we feel before every phone call is just part of being a good parent. But let me ask you something. Would you want your closest friend to feel that way in their own family? Would you ever tell someone else to put up with being ignored, blamed, or punished for having their own thoughts? Of course not. So why should you? When dysfunction becomes your normal, it takes real strength to unlearn it. But it starts with simply noticing when something feels off, noticing when your body tenses around them, noticing when your voice goes quiet, not because you're at peace, but because you're afraid of what might happen if you speak. That's not normal. That's survival. and you deserve more than just surviving. Now let's talk about something else that keeps many parents trapped in unhealthy dynamics: taking responsibility for someone else's emotions. This one is sneaky because it often feels like love. It can look like being supportive. It can sound like, "I just want to make sure he's okay," or, "If I don't help her through this, who will?" But underneath that, there's a heavy burden, a belief that you are responsible for how your child feels, that if they're upset, you must have done something wrong, that if they're anxious, it's on you to fix it, that if they lash out, it's probably because you didn't say something the right way. That's not love. That's emotional servitude. Let's be clear, caring about your children is natural and beautiful. But when that care turns into guilt, when their emotions become your job to manage, that's a problem. Especially when they've trained you, whether intentionally or not, to believe that your happiness must always come second to theirs. You might find yourself apologizing just to end a conversation, even when you didn't do anything wrong. You might stop sharing how you really feel just to keep the peace. Or maybe you put your own needs on the shelf for years, always believing, once they're okay, I'll be okay. But here's the hard truth: some people are never okay. Not because you didn't try hard enough, but because they're not ready to take ownership of their own emotional world. And until they do, they'll keep expecting you to carry it for them. You've probably heard the phrase walking on eggshells. For many parents of adult children with strong, self-focused patterns, that's not just a phrase, it's a way of life. You analyze every word, you second-guess every voicemail, you feel the weight of their silence more than the joy of their presence, and that's no way to live. You don't have to take responsibility for their anger, their disappointment, or their confusion. You can listen with compassion, but you don't have to absorb the storm. You can say, "I'm sorry you feel that way," without rushing in to fix it. You can let them feel their feelings without making those feelings your fault. That's not cold. That's called boundaried love. It means you love yourself too, not just them. And speaking of boundaries, let's talk about what happens when you try to be different in a family that rewards sameness. If your child has traits that revolve around control or self-focus, chances are they've made it very clear, whether with words or with silence, that they prefer you one way: agreeable, available, and always on their side. They like it when you mirror them, when you agree, when you nod, even if you're unsure, when you support their choices, even if they go against your values, when you say yes, even though every fiber of your being is screaming no. But the moment you show difference, when you speak up, when you say no, when you question their narrative, that's when the punishment starts. Maybe not with yelling, but with distance, with coldness, with blame, with withdrawal. Suddenly, you're not the good parent anymore. You're difficult, you're dramatic, you're selfish, you're just trying to start something. But let me tell you something that might sound radical. You are allowed to be different. You're allowed to see the world through your own eyes. You're allowed to have your own values, your own voice, your own way of showing up in the world. You are not meant to be a reflection of your child. And if the only time they are warm, kind, or respectful is when you stay small, quiet, and agreeable, then what they're offering isn't real connection. It's conditional approval. It's love with strings attached. Real love allows for difference. It makes space for disagreement without punishment. It welcomes boundaries, because boundaries mean both people matter. You don't have to keep shrinking just to be loved. And I know that's easier said than done, especially when you've spent years, maybe decades, being the kind of parent who bends, adapts, sacrifices. You did it out of love, out of hope, out of that deep desire to keep your child close. But closeness without honesty is not connection, it's control. And you deserve real connection, even if it takes time, even if it means rebuilding your identity without their permission, even if it means finally choosing yourself. Have you ever looked back on your life and realized that you've spent years, maybe decades, playing a role that was handed to you instead of a life you chose yourself? When you're the parent of an adult child with deeply self-focused or controlling patterns, roles become something of a family tradition. There's the role of the peacekeeper, always smoothing out rough edges so no one gets upset. The role of the provider, always giving more time, more money, more emotional labor than you can comfortably afford. The role of the listener, who never gets listened to in return. Or the role of the problem parent, the one who's blamed anytime something doesn't go the way they want. The strangest part is, after a while, you start to forget that it's just a role. It starts to feel like your identity. These roles don't come out of nowhere. They're often assigned early. Sometimes when the child is still young and learning how to manipulate or control their environment. You become the strong one, so they don't have to take responsibility, or the sensitive one, so they can dismiss your needs, or the difficult one, so they can avoid looking at their own behavior. They write the script, and you're expected to perform it. Even today, you might notice that, as soon as you speak up or try something new, they react as if you've broken the rules of a play you didn't even know you were in. They get irritated when you say no. They get offended when you don't drop everything to help. They act as if you've betrayed them simply by growing, changing, or having a life outside their expectations. And here's what's important. If you've been in that role long enough, it can feel terrifying to step out of it. You might worry that you'll lose the relationship altogether, or that they'll punish you with silence or blame, or even that you're somehow doing something wrong by wanting a life that's truly yours. But those roles were never who you were. They were assignments, and you're allowed to hand them back. When you stop playing the role, you create space for your real self to emerge. You give yourself permission to say what you believe, to take care of your own needs, to stand steady instead of shrinking into a version of yourself that keeps someone else comfortable. You might be surprised by how freeing that feels, and by how much strength you still have inside you, waiting for room to breathe. Now let's talk about something that trips up a lot of parents, no matter how wise or experienced they are. It's the idea that being emotionally reactive is the same thing as being emotionally authentic. Children with strong self-centered or controlling patterns are experts at making their reactions look like truth. Their anger feels like conviction. Their coldness feels like moral authority. Their hurt feelings feel like proof that you've done something wrong. And over time, you start to believe that the bigger reaction must be the more real one. That the person who feels the strongest must be right. But that's not authenticity. That's emotional intensity masquerading as clarity. When someone has a big reaction, slamming doors, raising their voice, shutting down, accusing, crying on cue, it doesn't necessarily mean their feelings are more valid. It just means their reaction is louder. And if you grew up or spent years around that kind of emotional noise, it's easy to confuse the two. You might even start to believe that your calmness is a flaw. Maybe you think you're too quiet, too gentle, too measured. Maybe you've told yourself, well, maybe she's right. If she's this upset, I must have said something wrong. But being calm, thoughtful, or reflective is not weakness. It's emotional adulthood. It's stability. And there's something else that may surprise you. Children with strong self-focused or reactive patterns often see your calmness as a threat. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because your grounded presence exposes the instability of their behavior. When you stay calm, you're no longer feeding their fire. You're not playing the emotional game that keeps them in control. So, they may try harder. They may push buttons. They may escalate, not to express truth, but to regain power. You don't have to match their intensity. You don't have to defend yourself against every accusation. You don't have to explain your entire heart every time they're upset. Authenticity isn't loud, it's honest. It's steady. It's knowing what you feel without needing someone else to validate it. And most importantly, authenticity is about being connected to your own emotional world, not drowning in someone else's. Which brings us to something just as essential: having internal boundaries. Most people think boundaries are just about what you say no to. But before you can set an external boundary, before you can tell someone, "I'm not comfortable with that," or "that doesn't work for me," you need internal boundaries. These are the boundaries that separate your inner world from theirs. They help you recognize the difference between your feelings and their feelings, your thoughts and their expectations, your truth and their narrative. Without internal boundaries, everything gets mixed together. If your child is upset, suddenly you're upset. If they're disappointed, you feel ashamed. If they criticize you, you take it as a fact instead of an opinion. Their emotional weather becomes your emotional climate. That's not connection, that's enmeshment. And children with strong enmeshing or controlling patterns thrive in that lack of separation. Because the blurrier the lines are, the easier it is for them to shape your reality. They can convince you that they know what you meant better than you do. They can tell you how you should feel. They can rewrite history right in front of you. And because your internal boundary is weak, you may start to doubt your own memory. But when you strengthen your internal boundaries, something powerful happens. You begin to say to yourself, "That's their feeling, not mine. That's their interpretation, not the truth. That's their disappointment, not my responsibility." You stop absorbing and start observing. You stop reacting and start choosing. You stop being defined by their moods and start living from your center. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is choose not to carry emotions that don't belong to you. And I want to say something, especially important for those of you who have spent your whole lives putting everyone else first. You are allowed to have your own inner world. You are allowed to have your own thoughts, your own experiences, your own peace. You don't have to justify it, apologize for it, or hide it. You're not responsible for managing someone else's reality. You're responsible for honoring your own. There's a quiet kind of grief that often goes unspoken in families, especially for parents who've spent their lives trying to love a child who only seems to love a version of them that isn't real. If you've ever felt like no matter what you do, it's never enough. If you've noticed that the real you, your thoughts, your boundaries, your joy, somehow keeps getting rejected or ignored, there's a reason for that. And it brings us to the last, most powerful emotional mechanism children with these patterns often use. They replace your real self with what I call the family super self. Now, what does that mean? It means that over time, your child, consciously or not, has built a version of you that exists mainly to serve them. This version of you doesn't have needs, or at least not inconvenient ones. It doesn't say no. It doesn't challenge or question. It agrees. It shows up. It doesn't make waves. It's not really you, but it becomes the only you they seem to accept. You might notice that when you go along with this role, things feel smooth for a while. But the moment you break character, by setting a boundary, asking for something, or even just living your own life, they push back, hard. Suddenly they're cold, critical, distant, or angry. And you find yourself wondering, what just happened? I thought we were fine. That's what happens when someone falls in love with the version of you they created, and not the person you truly are. Over time, this super self becomes so embedded in the family system that it feels like you don't have permission to be anyone else. You become afraid to speak honestly because you know it'll disrupt the image they've built of you. You second-guess yourself. You hide your truth. You try to live up to this impossible standard, not because you want to, but because you're afraid of losing what little connection is left, and it's exhausting. But here's what I want you to hear, clearly and gently. You do not owe your child a false version of yourself just to keep the peace. You do not have to keep performing the role of the endlessly self-sacrificing parent, just because that's what they expect. You are allowed to be real. You are allowed to say, "This is who I am. This is what I value. This is what I need." You are allowed to live a life that reflects you, not the story they've written for you. And yes, when you start doing that, there may be pushback. People who benefited from the false version of you are going to struggle when the real you starts showing up. That's not a sign you're doing something wrong. That's a sign that your healing is working. The truth is, the longer we live in the shadow of someone else's expectations, the harder it is to feel joy, peace, and freedom. It's like trying to breathe under a heavy blanket. You might be surviving, but you're not really living. And you deserve to live, not just exist for others, not just meet needs that were never yours to carry. Live. Maybe that means taking up a hobby again, something you gave up long ago. Maybe it means setting a boundary, even if your voice shakes the first time you do it. Maybe it means letting go of guilt that never belonged to you in the first place. Maybe it means reconnecting with friends who actually make you feel seen, or simply sitting outside on a quiet morning, cup of coffee in hand, and realizing that this moment belongs entirely to you. Your story doesn't end with the role your child gave you. Your life isn't over just because a family dynamic has grown toxic or cold. You are not too old to reclaim your voice, your boundaries, your peace. In fact, there's no better time than now, because the years ahead of you, they can be full of beauty, of truth, of gentle mornings and strong boundaries, of saying yes to what fills you and no to what drains you, of looking in the mirror and seeing someone who no longer needs to play a part, but who gets to just be. The real you was never lost, just hidden, covered by layers of survival, of people-pleasing, of stories that were never true. But the good news is, at any moment, you can start to uncover that self again. And don't let anyone tell you that boundaries are cruel, or that choosing yourself is selfish, or that being real is too much. Those are the voices of people who benefited from your silence, not the voice of truth. Truth is quiet, peaceful, steady, and once you start listening to it again, you'll wonder how you ever lived without it. You may never get the apology you deserve. Your child may never see the pain they caused. They may continue to twist the story so that you remain the problem. That's their work, not yours. Your work now is to come home to yourself, to forgive yourself for all the times you bent too far, to honor yourself for surviving what you didn't deserve, to celebrate yourself for being strong enough to look at the truth and choose healing anyway. And if no one's told you this yet today, you're doing better than you think. You're not broken. You're not crazy. You're not a bad parent. You're just waking up. So take a deep breath. Let it all go. The guilt, the shame, the roles, the silence. And with every breath forward, make a little more room for the person you were always meant to be. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being brave enough to face this truth. And thank you for choosing yourself, maybe for the first time in a long time. If this message touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. You're not alone in this. And if you found comfort here, please give the video a thumbs up. It really helps more people like you find our community. Don't forget to subscribe to Strong Elderly Life, so you never miss a message that matters. Here's to living your truth. Here's to peace. Here's to you.